most horrifying monsters come to life. Are you brave enough to witness these spine-chilling encounters?
During our honeymoon, my husband and I traveled between ghost towns in our camping trailer on overland and unpaved roads. For about a week, we had been choosing a town and setting up camp nearby for the night. Nothing unusual or spooky happened at any point, only some historical events and natural occurrences. I was particularly excited to visit Garnett, Montana. It's only a short distance from Missoula, and we had contacted our friend, an outfitter in Billings, to inquire about a camping location. There are flat spots just up the mountain, he claimed. Now that we always travel with our 2 dogs and cat, we had a 17-year-old Tahoe with big tires, a rooftop tent, and sleeping quarters in the cabin. So all we actually need is a good location. We're good as long as it's slightly hidden. I noticed some dilapidated homes and a few abandoned cars as we traveled up the mountain's backside off the main road. Nothing too strange, but I couldn't get rid of the growing pit in my stomach. My natural apprehension increased as we ascended further and passed the parking lot for the abandoned town. You know, the addition of the fight or flight response. My dogs were in a frenzy. Naturally, I dismissed it as them simply needing to leave. But when we did, I realized my husband and I hadn't spoken the entire 45-minute drive up, even though we had finally found a flat spot. I grabbed his hands as he attempted to exit the vehicle to check if it was level, while the dogs were pacing, barking, and whining. I begged you not to turn out the lights. I believe I noticed eyes. He simply asked why he had to before we stopped, and cast a bewildered glance my way. He did, however, keep the cabin lights on. All I could think about when he exited was how someone or something was watching. Even though I had no idea what it was, I had the impression that it had followed us from where the eyes had flashed. I told him not to let the dogs out just yet when he came back, and he replied that we should leave right away. There's a problem. We frequently camp, and while I get frightened, my husband never does. We typically hang out, and I unwind, so it's okay. He has never moved from a location as a result of my alarm. I could tell he felt something too when he suggested that we leave. We accelerated as we took a different, paved route to I-90. The dogs were blocking my view when I turned to look in the rearview mirror. Additionally, the tent was so dark at night that visibility was poor. However, there was a rumble outside that suggested a large object was moving.
If you think you can handle more horror, just keep on watching, but don't say we didn't warn you.
The tenseness increased. He and I were arguing while the dogs were pacing, and then it began to snow heavily. Out of the blue, a stark white rabbit dashed in front of the car as we turned, and we hit it. After that, there was a silence among us all until we descended the mountain and turned onto a side road, at which point all of our fear vanished. Go around Missoula to the other side, where we were camping. No creepiness at all. At least until the following day. We noticed a point when we ascended the mountain that we both started feeling uneasy as we were driving back to Garnett on the main mountain road we came out on. After we made the sharp turn, I asked my husband, "Hey, where's the rabbit?" It vanished. No animal tracks, no blood, and no carcass. There is no sign that it has ever been there. I can accept that it was taken, but there is no sign of it. We were the first ones up there, which is rude. We were the only tire tracks on the way down, and I would have expected to see blood or something. It had just vanished. We could still make out our tracks from the previous night, so the snow wasn't deep enough to have buried it. Simply no rabbit. We eventually arrived at the ghost town, which is actually quite fascinating. One of the eyes said, "Yeah, there's something up here," as we were discussing the creepiness on the mountain with the rangers. I wouldn't spend the night by myself. "What specifically did you see and feel?" the other person asked with a smile. I then admitted to him my fear. I'm talking about a deep, primal fear that it was ancient, not human, and possibly never had been human. I claimed that it wasn't a ghost or a crazy, living person. Rather, I just had the strangest feeling that something was out to get us. And I admitted that I couldn't be certain, but I thought I had seen its red eyes at one point. However, based on where I saw the eyes, I did believe it was stalking or following us. "There's a Wendigo up here," he said as he turned to face me. "That is what it is, right?" I didn't, but I nearly broke down in tears when he described the lore. He accurately described it, right down to the eyes. A few months later, I was telling my stepmother the story, and she asked, "You know what rabbits are, right?" She had been looking into American Indian symbolism. I obviously didn't. The belief that rabbits are warrior spirits and that when one comes, he is fighting for you is common. That rabbit gave his life to save you guys. My husband said, "You know, after we saw the rabbit, whatever it was, stopped chasing us," as I felt a chill that night.
Can't get enough of these terrifying tales. Continue watching, but beware, you never know what's lurking in the shadows.
Early in September 1978, while my son and I were camping, we arrived at the horse corral near Groundhog Meadow after a late Friday night. With the intention of returning to the area later that year to hunt, we spent the entire Saturday constructing 2 deer blinds. At the time, there wasn't a lot of recreational activity in the area, and we only saw one other person. But there were 3 strange things that happened while we were camping on Saturday night. First, my son and I heard 2 screams early in the evening. Near the horse corral, the first scream was heard. The scream sounded like it was coming from a huge object. It sounded like a very large, enraged man and was extremely loud and low-pitched. Since I've been hunting my entire life, I've heard mountain lions before, but this was unlike anything I've ever heard. A short while later, we heard a similar scream, but this time it was coming from the east, almost as if it were coming from the immigrant wilderness. Although we both agreed that we had heard the screams, we were unsure of what they were. My son looked in the horse corral but found nothing. But as we were huddled around the campfire later that evening, I caught sight of a pair of red eyes staring at me from close by the horse corral. The area around the eyes was completely dark, so I'm not sure if the firelight could penetrate that far to make the eyes reflect red. I initially assumed it was a deer or some other animal, but it soon became clear to me that the eyes were at least 6 to 7 feet above the ground because I knew the area so well. I was aware that there were no nearby trees or other structures for an animal like an owl or whatever to perch on. I asked my son if he had seen it as well after watching it for about 30 minutes, and he confirmed this. He and I were under observation for another 30 minutes, a total of an hour. But after I turned my head for a moment and then looked back, the eyes were gone. My son and I both went outside the following morning to make sure there weren't any trees or other structures that an animal could stand on and appear to be 7 feet tall. The most recent incident took place the same evening we went to my camper for dinner and to go to bed. The camper was at least 5 feet off the ground and sitting on the bed of my utility truck. We both felt and heard a loud bang or thud on the camper's front driver's side while we were preparing sandwiches. We grabbed our flashlights and ran outside after the camper was hit so hard that the entire truck shook, expecting to see either a tree limb or a very disoriented deer. Nothing was visible. Even after circling the camper, we failed to spot anything. Then, we both understood that the object that had struck the camper had to be at least 6 feet tall and could not have been a deer darting through the dark without looking. The incident all seemed strange to us, but nothing else happened that night, so we simply went home. The following day, we went back to the area to go hunting later that year, but this time we heard or saw nothing. I appreciate that.
Ready for another round of spine-tingling tales?
At my grandma's home, I was staying a month with my cousins. My cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15, and I was the oldest. It was the month of August. Being 15 years old, I was housed with two 10 and 14-year-olds. We frequently stayed up late telling scary stories, but after a few weeks we made the decision to build a campfire in the backyard. The home of my grandma is located in a rural suburb. When you're driving to her house from the road, the neighbors aren't too far away, but the backyard is a dense forest with paths cut through it. Since each home is perched atop a hill, the basement actually had an underground portion. It won't matter until later. We were therefore in a small area of open land on the east side of her yard. There was probably 3/4 of a mile to each side of us that belonged to my grandma, and you couldn't see the neighboring yards from there. After telling spooky stories and playing truth or dare, my 14-year-old cousin challenged the 13-year-old and I had to take a 10-minute walk through the paths. It was probably around 11 o'clock at night. My younger cousin was a little more reserved than my older cousin, but I immediately said yes because I wasn't easily startled and was generally calm. Since it wasn't completely dark yet and we could see well enough to avoid dying, we didn't bring a flashlight. After about 5 minutes of meandering through the paths, we decided to turn around because we could hardly see the fire through the trees. A large dog-like creature stood in the center of the path, hunched over and with its front hands barely off the ground. Its eyes were so fucking bright white, and its humanoid, dog-shaped shape with a human-like head but a dog-like body, human hands and feet are what I remember most about it. As it ran away from us in the opposite direction toward a creek that ran through the yard, it looked directly at us, and I knew I was frozen with fear. The other cousins and my grandmother eventually rushed to us as my cousin and I screamed bloody fucking murder. I don't recall much of this because I was so confused and unable to think clearly, but I did wake up in bed, so I figured I had been taken up to the house. Since my bed was positioned right up against a large glass window and the room was on the side of the house that wasn't underground, I could see my cousins playing outside while they slept in the basement in a large room with sliding glass doors to the outside. I put on a jacket and hurried outside to join them because the house is in Michigan, where it can get a little chilly even at the end of August due to a light breeze. I skipped breakfast because I don't want to miss anything fun. They were playing it all when I sat down. Instead, they were rushing to find my grandmother. Her canines. They were both ripped apart and dead. We went to bed early that night, and I didn't wake up until maybe 2 in the morning, feeling like my head had been struck. On the double bed, my cousins were all seated. 2 double beds and a bunk bed were located on the opposite side of the room from me. The twin beds for me and my cousin, who is 14 years old. They were silent and fixated on me. The 13-year-old boy gave the window a head nod. I became frozen. They all exhibited extreme fear. A really messed up looking face was pressed to the window, its gaping eyes staring down at me as I turned just a little to the side. I yelled so loudly that the thing fled. I told my grandma what had happened, and she called the police, but they didn't find anything. After that, I went home and didn't venture outside at night again.
Feeling fearless? Dive into more chilling stories with our next video, but remember, you might not sleep soundly tonight.
In the middle to late 1980s. The precise year escapes me. In order to visit some family friends who lived outside of Coudersport, Pennsylvania, my family traveled there. Although the trip there was tedious, we knew it would be enjoyable because they lived on a farm. Although it wasn't a large farm, they did have a few cows and other animals. It was probably more of a pastime than anything else. We enjoyed learning about the animals when we arrived and checking them out in general. However, my age-related friend Tom suggested that we climb the mountain behind his house. Since everywhere we've lived has been flat, I thought that was really cool. It was kind of cool to be in the mountains. To follow Tom, who knew the best route up there, my little brother Josh, his little brother Keith, and I all went up. When we finally reached the top, we thought, hey, maybe we can camp out here tonight. It was pretty difficult going because the mountain got steeper as we went. Tom and I were the oldest and were only around 14 years old at the time, but we got so excited to do it that we just started setting up a campsite without even asking our parents for permission. Our parents reluctantly agreed when we eventually made our way back down to the house and asked if we could actually go back up there. Due to the fact that it was late spring and relatively warm during the day but extremely cold at night, Tom's father searched his home for some extra sleeping bags as we gathered our gear and decided to also pull some on a sled behind us while using rope to the back. Our father reassured us as we trudged up the hill that they would check on us later before we went to bed. Man, parenting back in the 1980s was so much easier to get away with than it is today. In addition to some other snacks, including some marshmallows to roast over a fire, we had brought along some sandwiches that our mothers had made for us. We made the arduous climb back up the mountain, arrived at our campsite, and quickly erected 2 pup tents. Even though it was still fairly early in the evening, around 6, we built a fire pit and started a fire. It was getting pretty dark quickly because of all the trees around us, so we wanted to be sure we had a fire going and plenty of firewood nearby so we wouldn't have to go looking for it at night. We were just being guys, laughing, enjoying ourselves, and drinking soda. We all stopped when we heard someone approaching us at around 8:30, completely forgetting that our dad had said they would come and check on us in the light of the fire. They came and complimented us on how well we had organized our camp before spending some time with us. At first, my father suggested that perhaps this wasn't such a good idea. He was silenced, though, and we all decided to stay. While roasting marshmallows and sharing spooky tales, we stayed up quite late. We figured we'd burn a few more logs and then head into our tents when we decided it was probably time to go to bed. Keith then asked, "You guys see that?" as we were working on that. Each of us gave him a bewildered look. "What are you referring to?" He then pointed into the distance, where all that could be seen was darkness. I asked, "What are you talking about?" as I kept looking. "Nothing is visible to me." Josh, however, my younger brother, then asked, "Yeah, what's that?" "A bear, is that?" After a few seconds, our eyes adjusted, and Tom and I were able to see what they were seeing as well. Although there are many bears in the world, this was not one of them. We sat and observed it attempting to identify what it was. Only two piercing yellow eyes, perhaps 6 feet off the ground, were visible to us in the darkness. But something odd was going on with them. We became aware that it was approaching us when they kept, bobbing up and down. Could that be an owl? I asked Tom as I turned to face him. It may be hurt or acting strangely because it is flying erratically. Tom said, "I've never seen an owl do anything like that," while shaking his head. And as it drew nearer, the hazy outlines of the fire started to give this thing's shape more definition. Finally, we caught a glimpse of it, and I'm telling the truth to you now. Although it stood about 6 feet tall, its arms hung very low on its body. It had a slight resemblance to a man, but its head was tightly packed against its chest, as if it lacked any neck at all. Its knees were bent at an angle, resembling the back of a goat, and its long arms drooped past its knees. After watching the awful film Monos, The Hands of Fate, I would later quip, "Don't even bother watching it, it's terrible." But from the waist down, this thing kind of resembled the bad special effects they had of a guy who was dressed up to look like a goat. We didn't flee for some reason. Instead, we screamed in terror into the night. We were all standing there in awe of this object. Nobody spoke, and
Keep watching, but remember, there's no turning back now.
nobody spoke, and as it gradually drew nearer to us, it made no noise either. When it was finally on the verge of the fire's actual bright light, it stood up. We were all rooted to the ground in shock and terror, and I can't even begin to tell you how terrified we were. This creature had brighter yellow eyes and yellow skin, and once more its head appeared to be embedded almost to its chest. It then raised one of its extremely long arms and pointed back down the hill over our shoulders after opening a strange-looking mouth with only a few teeth in it. Once more, we didn't freak out and run away for no apparent reason. Tom suggested that we simply pack up and leave. This thing continued to stare at us for another 10 or 15 seconds before slowly re-entering the shadows. This time it comes back to us and just fades away without making any noise. We all turned to face one another and agreed that we should probably leave. We were aware that returning down the hill at night would be hazardous. There was no way we were going to stay up there despite the fact that we knew our parents would yell at us. Therefore, we gathered all of our belongings and pulled out our flashlights before putting out the fire. After which we headed back down the hill. After securing the camp and being certain that the fire had been put out permanently, we started to make our way down the hill, slipping and sliding halfway down while being quite frightened and attempting to move as quickly as we could. When we arrived on the back porch just before midnight, our parents were still awake and engaged in whatever it is that his parents do. They were furious that we had descended the hill without telling them, and while they were furious, they didn't bother to ask what the heck had happened up there before sending us to bed. We could only determine that they were quite enraged. It was a Sunday when we woke up the following morning, and my family was planning to return home. When we later described what we had seen to them, everyone nodded in agreement and said, "Yeah, sure, that's what happened." Our fathers exchanged winks while observing the terrified children in the woods. They were unable to manage it. Possibly allowing them to ascend there was a mistake. We saw what we saw, that's all I know. Keith, sadly, is no longer with us. Several years ago, he passed away. Extremely youthful for his age. I stopped talking to Tom. I'm unsure of his current residence. I should also ask my mother because I am aware that he and his mother are still close. Of course, I keep in touch with my younger brother Josh, and since it has been so long, we do occasionally discuss it. It does seem more like a bizarre fable that has been passed down through the generations to terrify children into staying out of the woods. But we are aware of what we saw. I've never heard anyone tell a story quite like the one we have, whatever that thing might be. I'm not aware of any other legends involving something similar. Although it might have been a hi-hat of legend, it most definitely lacked a hi-hat. It had a head that was extremely low. Whatever the case, I have no way of knowing if that strange creature is still prowling the Pennsylvania mountains near Cowersport.
You've survived the terror of these 4 horror monsters encounters, but the nightmare isn't over yet. Don't forget to subscribe to Terrifying Tales TV for more blood-curdling stories that will haunt your dreams. Sleep tight or not.